Too Long Didn't Read. Brought to you by the Alan Turing Institute, the National Institute for Data Science and AI. Welcome to Too Long Didn't Read. Think of us like those people who live in the big towers in the middle of the forest looking out for fires. We're like them, but the fires are AI. Not suggesting AI is like a fire, but that some forest fires are good, they help the ecosystem, but nonetheless, they need to be monitored, as does AI, and we monitor it. And then, radio back to base if it gets out of hand. We're AI and data science fire marshals. I'm Jonah, a content creator here at the Turing, not a metaphor creator.
And I'm Smera, a researcher in data justice and global ethical futures.
This month on Too Long Didn't Read, we find out what part misinformation played in this year's many elections. Plus, we explore if AI can help to keep space spacious. As Series 2 draws to a close, we want to look back from whence we came. In our first episode of this series in May, we spoke to the Turing's Megan Hughes, who gave us an idea of what misinformation we could expect in 2024.
So some of the main takeaways from that episode were: misinformation is not new. With the development of generative AI, bad actors have lots of new methods of creating and distributing misinformation, and that we shouldn't believe all of the hype. And finally, that misinformation is not as prolific as we might be led to believe.
So we thought as we come to the end of the season and the year, we should look back and find out if indeed it was all just hype or there were some unexpected consequences of misinformation.
We've roped in Megan's colleague, research associate Sam Stockwell from CETaS, the Center for Emerging Technology and Security, here at the Turing.
Sam came to the Turing from RAND, where he worked on a wide portfolio of defence and security research, spanning military workforce issues, human security concerns, UK defence strategy and emerging technologies. His research interests currently focus on the intersection between national security and the online domain, particularly in relation to countering radicalisation and violent extremism through both policy and technical solutions.
He is also the co-author for the report AI-enabled influence operations, safeguarding future elections.
Welcome, Sam.
Hi, guys. Thank you for having me today.
We just want to mention that we've also asked our audience on social media if there are any questions they have about misinformation. And a couple of those questions will be interspersed throughout this chat.
So it's been a busy year for you, I imagine, Sam. The biggest election year in history, more than 70 countries, more than 3 billion people, loads of first-time voters, loads of big nations with lots of power and lots of money. So how do you feel? Was following misinformation activity for the elections disheartening, or are you feeling optimistic?
I would probably say a bit of both. I think on the one hand, I was slightly reassured about the fact that, yes, in similar to what Megan said on the previous episode, we didn't see the worst case scenarios that many had speculated and feared in this space. So, for example, this idea that tsunamis of AI-generated deepfake material were going to flood social media, everyone wouldn't have a clue what to believe or what to know was real, and we would see everyone being influenced to sort of believe whatever the deepfakes wanted us to believe.
Yeah,
we didn't see that necessarily. And so, for example, in the US election, we did see, say, more evidence that there was AI-generated disinformation and misinformation circulating online. But still, one of the challenges in measuring the impact of that on election results is that, unfortunately, because they're online-based content, it's really difficult to know to what extent exposure to that and things such as likes or sharing of that content actually translates to changes in real world voter intentions and attitudes and political beliefs.
Yeah.
So I think on the one hand, yes, we were reassured with that observation, but at the same time, we did see some worrying signs that, yes, unfortunately, these threats are having a negative impact, not on just the election cycle, but also on the wider democratic system. So, for example, again, taking the US election, we did see how some viral cases of deepfakes and other forms of AI-generated content that was misleading voters did actually shape election discourse and had an effect at actually the very top of the kind of political apparatus, where the likes of, say, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris were actually commenting and discussing some of these sort of cases during things like live presidential debates. And so obviously there's a risk there that this content is shaping the type of things we're talking about during elections, some of which is not actually true evidential-based content or issues that we should be discussing.
Yeah. What tools do you use to track all the information? Are you using the same tools as I am to just sort of view the world?
In some ways, yes. So on the one hand, we did kind of look at the open source literature. So we did look at, say, any news articles, research reports, kind of statements coming out from, say, intelligence agencies that were publicly available that would talk about the ways that these sort of AI tools are being used to generate mis and disinformation during elections. And that's partly because one of the issues we have is that access to social media data is really difficult. It's either really expensive or it's just not available to actually use and access. And so we're kind of limited in being able to kind of monitor these trends actively in real time. But having said that, we were also able to do some what's called network analysis. And that's where we kind of use the third party sort of, I guess you could say, data provider to gain access to some of that social media data, more kind of historical data, but to really kind of understand who the key networks and influence nodes were in sharing some of those deepfakes during the US election. And so that was kind of really interesting, looking into, the type of accounts that were able to really amplify that content to other online communities.
Yeah, it must be fascinating.
So maybe because this much time has gone past, can you say there are certain trends emerging around misinformation when it comes to politics?
So in terms of trends, I think one of the things that I'm noticing is that increasingly, because of particularly around the use of AI in this context, because the tools are now so accessible, all you need really is an account to sign up onto some of these open source models or even things like ChatGPT. It becomes very easy now for non-skilled, ordinary members of the public to be able to create this type of content. And whilst in some cases people weren't intentionally wanting to, say, confuse people or damage the integrity of the online information space, I think what we are seeing is that in some cases where people have shared this content thinking that it may be funny or that they just don't like, say, a politician in particular, that actually there are some indirect consequences as a result of that. So the fact that the content is really realistic, for example, means that if it gets shared within more communities and the kind of original context of that content is less and less clearer, there is a risk there that people start to assume it's true because they can't tell the difference between whether it's, say, AI generated or real content. Another one is around actually how much of this content was originally stemming from, in some cases, politicians, social media influencers, and sort of domestic political bloggers online were also having a role to play in sort of creating a lot of this harmful, sort of misleading narratives. And actually what the sort of AI tools were doing was helping to spread that message to a much wider range of online communities. So it was almost acting as a sort of amplifier rather than kind of revolutionizing the actual form of disinformation itself, which I thought was quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything we can look out for in 2025?
I think what we may see in terms of trends here and sort of looking more at the kind of worrying side of things, we are more likely to see in the next few years perhaps a move towards things like micro-targeting. So this is the idea that you can try and sort of narrow down your messaging and your narratives to specifically try and sort of hook in or attract different demographic views or interests. So, for example, targeting people from a certain ethnic or national background with specific messages to try and make them more likely to be convinced by your kind of operation or your activities. And so there's a risk potentially with things like chatbots where people might want to try and micro-target different communities in future elections or politics more broadly to try and make their messages more convincing. But at the same time, I do think there is a lot of opportunity as well from using AI to actually counter these threats, so almost using AI against AI. So, we did see during the UK election, for example, that some fact-checking organizations were actually using new generative AI tools to help sift through and verify manifesto pledges against what was being mentioned and discussed during some of the live TV debates. And actually, there is potential to sort of use these tools to better detect when mis and disinformation is circulating online and to sort of help triage the volume of content that fact checkers have to go through, given there is so much that gets floated around on social media, that actually the AI tools could offer a benefit here in sort of helping to manage that workflow process and triage what they consider to be the most urgent sort of misinformed or misleading narratives that should be debunked or exposed.
Yeah, so I mean, hearing about all of these different ways in which they're targeting different groups and what it looks like in the future, I do wonder what that means for public trust. Do you see this year of election misinformation affecting public trust, and how permanent do you think that damage is?
So yeah, I do think it's a real issue. One of the things that we certainly noticed is that often in the last year or so, there have been signs that users have really struggled to know what to believe is, say, genuine information versus AI generated content. And as I said before, that's sort of largely because of the fact that the AI generated content now is so realistic that unless it's labeled, it's really difficult to tell the difference. That becomes a problem for trusting whether any information, even if it's coming from a verified, credible source, should be trusted because you just don't know anymore.
Sorry, just on the point that you were making about how it's hard to like believe some of these images. I
Mm.
was just recalling the time when saw some of those images from the floods in Valencia and just the sheer scale of damage that took place, which I don't think I had seen something like that. It almost seemed AI generated, where you had streets that had cars piled on top of each other. It was so hard for us to actually believe.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue. And I think it kind of comes down to this idea now that because there is an assumption that AI generated content is so prevalent that if anything looks remotely suspicious or unnatural, we can kind of almost jump to the conclusion that it must be AI generated. And there are issues with that. There are concerns because in doing so, you kind of allow for conspiracy theories to then open up about, well, where did that content come from? Or if it's not real, then what really did happen? And it's easy to kind of assume that someone or something might be AI generated when actually it's legitimate. But I do think, yes, generally, one of the fundamental problems in this space, which is contributing to the issue, is that there is so much sort of lack of trust in whether it's kind of broadcasting media, whether it's public institutions and politicians. You know, there's been recent surveys by Ofcom showing that more UK-based users and citizens are getting their news from social media now, as opposed to, say, radio or TV or newspapers. And of course, that has problems because we know how much of this kind of disinformation and misinformation can crop up on social media, and that it's really difficult sometimes to know where your sources are coming from when you view posts. So I think with the combination of those trends, yes, it is going to have a role, and it's something that we would definitely need to address moving forward as one of the kind of the root causes of this problem.
Yeah. So just coming back to tools, we had a few questions online about this, what tools we have to spot or combat misinformation. And I was reading about this notion of having a sort of journalistic ethics layer on top of any online platforms, like a fact-checking tool or ethics tool or something. Is that possible that we could hope for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't necessarily know about that tool per se, but there is one that I think is quite similar that we have already seen in the last year during elections, which has been quite interesting. And that's actually, again, using AI to help in the process. But in Taiwan, there is a social media app called Line. It sort of operates similar to WhatsApp, but also your kind of X's and your Meta and Facebooks and things like that. And within that social media platform, they have a chatbot that's integrated within the app that essentially allows users to drop in sources or links to different pieces of content if they're unsure about how trustworthy it is. And crucially, what the app does is it scans the internet for known, verified, trusted sources that are talking about the same topic. And then what it will do is it will share those links with the user. So in many ways, it kind of allows the user to still make an informed judgment based on their kind of, own decision, but it's trying to push those kind of trusted sources to the user, rather than just allowing them to rely entirely on the source that they've come across on the social media app. So there is definitely precedent there where we've seen in recent elections.
Okay, so as long as the dead internet theory isn't true, then that's a useful tool.
Exactly.
We heard a lot from Beyonce, Taylor Swift, Hulk Hogan this year. Have you seen any evidence of non-state actors, influencers, celebrities having an effect on elections or the information landscape?
Yeah, so I think that there is an interesting one around Taylor Swift, for example. So you may remember back during the campaign period when supposedly she came out endorsing Trump, Trump himself tweeted that he said, "Oh, I'm very happy that Taylor Swift has endorsed me." And it caused huge uproar because these were based on, pieces of content that he saw online, sort of suggesting that, Taylor Swift had endorsed him. And actually what was interesting was some of that content was AI manipulated. So it wasn't entirely AI generated, but they had taken real photos of Swift supporters who were voting for, say, Kamala Harris, and they edited the content using AI to put Trump's name on the t-shirts, for example. And what was also quite interesting about that, though, was that Swift then ironically came out endorsing Kamala Harris and specifically cited the AI manipulated videos in Trump's tweet as causing a major reason as to why she decided to come out and support Kamala Harris. So in some ways, it was kind of a backfire for Trump.
Yeah.
And whether or not that had an influence on the amount of people that then registered and were, say, going to vote for Kamala Harris, I don't know, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I do think it's an interesting question. And it showed how, AI kind of backfired in that sort of context.
Yeah. It would be really interesting to know which had the sort of biggest impact, the initial misinformation, once that's out there before it's debunked, would have had a massive impact for Trump, right? Or was the bigger impact in Kamala Harris's favour when Taylor Swift came out and officially endorsed her?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I do think one of the big observations we did make was that, on the one hand, a lot of the kind of tactics that was being used to sort of create this impression of things happening that never did, not based in reality. It still requires people to come out and cover it in the news so that they ensure that the voters are getting accurate information. But what that means is it can deflect attention away from genuine problems that, say, Donald Trump was facing on the campaign trail. It sort of detracts attention away from those and sort of puts it onto like a really what should be a non-issue. And we saw it as well when Kamala Harris had a rally and Trump came out saying no, it was AI generated. And we literally saw articles with things such as the top 10 reasons why Kamala Harris's rally was real and not AI generated. And you just wonder, this shouldn't have to be reported on, but it did.
So do you see in the future any kind of combating this as journalists might have to? Like, there's already a lot of people, for example, leaving Twitter. Guardian just left Twitter this week. Sorry, X. Will there have to come a point where it's like we can't just cover everything, even though millions of people might have seen it and it might be influencing something? We have to cover it in like a different way. We have to call it something different to news or something.
Yeah, no, I think one of the real challenges, particularly for journalists and fact checkers, and I don't sort of envy their role at all in this, but one of the issues is obviously balancing the need to ensure that they expose and debunk these kind of misleading viral cases, but at the same time, not inadvertently amplify it to more people and kind of make it a topic of discussion when it doesn't necessarily need to be. And I think one of the issues that journalists in particular face is that there is a lot of journalistic guidance in the UK, for example, but actually there is nothing on kind of what you should do when you're reporting incidents involving mis and disinformation or, say, an influence operation. And I think that's something that could be a really quick win, is to kind of update that guidance with the types of measures you might want or considerations you want to include in that, to sort of allow journalists to know where to go if they're coming across one of these cases and kind of make a judgment as to whether, yes, we should be reporting on it, or actually, if we do that, maybe we're doing more harm than good.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
But it does lead me to, I suppose, the next question by Raiz Gilani on Twitter did ask, who decides what is and isn't misinformation?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I do think that it's a really difficult area to sort of unpack because, of course, yes, what might be misinformation for some people, others consider it to be the truth. And there is a kind of fine line as well between when you're straying into something that is just outright misleading to when maybe it's just sort of slightly distorting or unknowing, not realizing what the facts are. And I think one of the solutions to get around that is, yes, I don't think that there should be a kind of top-down approach to this problem where you have kind of the government setting, sort of the idea of this should be what we consider as mis or disinformation. And if anyone disagrees with us, we're going to just ignore you. You're not kind of going to take on our kind of definition of that. And so one of the things that I think is really promising to sort of tackle that issue is what's known as kind of decentralized or community-based fact checking. And that's where you essentially allow users to debate and kind of discuss what they consider to be the truth. And so, for example, they're kind of an imperfect form at the moment, but on X there is a feature called Community Notes where users can vote on whether something should be given additional context, for example, on a post that might be, say, misleading or may not be including the full sort of picture of a news story. And whilst it's problematic at the moment because there's lots of disagreement over what should be considered evidence or factual, particularly when it comes to political stories, I do think there are ways to overcome that, where you have things such as point systems, which are provided to people that are known to have done successful fact checks and kind of provided informed, say, community notes, or things such as democratic consensus, where you require a certain amount of people to, say, vote on a fact-checking initiative that's been put out by a user to then determine whether it should be, posted online or not. So there are ways around it, but I definitely think, a decentralized approach is going to be key to this, because otherwise, you stray into that issue of who sets the sort of concept or idea of what is mis and disinformation, and actually, having it at the top by setting that at the kind of government level is quite problematic in my view.
Yeah, and it seems like a poll that was done back in September found very similar results from the audience as well. And this is across both LinkedIn and Twitter. A lot of similarity, where there's about 10 to 16% belief that the government should decide what's misinformation, but most of it going towards, independent NGOs or fact-checking organizations.
It's interesting that social media platforms have a higher percentage in that poll than mainstream media outlets. Does that suggest people would trust social media platforms more than mainstream media outlets? That's interesting.
That is an interesting question. Yeah. I'd be quite worried about that sort of idea, but I do think that probably does show the extent to which now people are kind of so used to getting their news on, say, social media that perhaps they are just generally more trustworthy towards it.
Okay, so more listeners' questions. When we met with Megan, we discussed about how misinformation isn't new. We've been lied to for centuries. Igor Krev on LinkedIn asks, people have been creating and using misinformation since the dawn of time. New tech tools won't change anything fundamental there. What I am concerned by is an increasing tendency to use misinformation as an excuse for censorship. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think, again, this is a really difficult one because, yes, on the one hand, we have to recognize that, for example, AI is just a tool, right? It can be used for good purposes and bad purposes, even though often the discussion focuses on the bad parts of it. And often it will depend on, who is using the tool. And so I think there is a worry here about, for example, a lot of countries, particularly in the US, have been exploring things like deepfake bans where, you are not allowed to create a deepfake whatsoever. It doesn't matter what kind of intentions behind it, what kind of content's included in it. We shouldn't be creating these. And whilst, there are some noble intentions behind that, I do think they miss the point where they're focusing too much on the actual tools rather than the kind of people behind them. And so, there's a risk there of a chilling effect on the willingness of people to, say, put out things like parody and satire, which has benefits for political discourse, kind of enriches our political culture, right?
Yeah.
And, AI can be used for that as well. So I definitely agree that there is a real fine line here between, sort of ensuring that people aren't being misled online, but also with ensuring that we're kind of preserving sort of freedom of speech. And unfortunately, there is no easy answer to that. I think one of the things, though, that we are increasingly seeing is that on certain social media platforms, whilst everyone, of course, has a right to post content, regardless of, say, what kind of is included in that, within, of course, the law, certain piece of content like terrorist content is illegal. But when you have kind of content that isn't illegal, but, everyone has the right to post it, that doesn't necessarily mean that content should be forced upon everyone to then view it. And I think that's where we start forgetting the aspect that is really critical to this area. Just because someone can post a piece of, say, misleading content, that doesn't mean that content should then be required to go at the top of everyone's feed. You should have the option to not have to view it. And that's the problem I think we're having at the moment, where this content is constantly being pushed to the top of everyone's social media feeds. And it's very difficult to get out of that. You can't help yourself from being exposed to it.
Yeah, and side note, just at time of recording, yesterday the news came out that they're considering banning social media for under 16-year-olds. So there'll be a whole argument of censorship on that. I can't really see it happening myself, but it's good to know that they're considering ways that they can protect at least young people from some of the harms of social media.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I'm curious to see how that gets enforced, and yeah, to see kind of what the extent to which that makes a difference as well in terms of exposure and also kind of perceptions of things like social media as a tool for news and information, and kind of the exposure to this type of misleading content.
I can't imagine that turning social media into one of those things that children aren't allowed, but is going to make them want it any less. Like, it's just going to become another like vice that they can't wait to get their hands on. They're going to be heavily disappointed. But Claire Stevenson on LinkedIn asks, while barely regulated recommender systems support the polarization of opinions and result in unhealthy echo chambers, is it important both to understand how this works and what this naturally leads on to? To what extent are social media algorithms responsible for the global rise in populism and public distrust of mainstream media and scientific consensus? We also had an email from George who asks, what mechanisms do you think should be in place to prevent algorithm-based AI-generated content from inciting extremists or politically motivated misinformation?
I've already touched upon this, but absolutely, I think the algorithm systems play a huge role in helping to amplify divisive, emotionally based kind of populist narratives. And that's because they're kind of trying to figure out content that is going to be clickbaity, that's going to get a lot of attraction, reaction, but also it may not necessarily be grounded in reality, or it may be kind of misleading. But that's not necessarily the things that the algorithms care about. They care about the clicks. In terms of measures to kind of help to counteract that, I do think more research and access to those algorithms will be really vital. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get that, but I think definitely being able to kind of look under the bonnet and see how they operate, and figure out how we might want to change the way they work would be really helpful. I know one thing that, for example, could go a long way is changing the kind of incentive structures of these algorithms. So rather than, say, amplifying content that is really attractive to clicks or likely to gain a reaction, actually maybe we should be amplifying trusted, known sources of information. So kind of using the algorithms for a positive benefit. Other forms might be also things such as, I guess you could say, I don't know how to describe it really, but almost kind of not necessarily hiding the content, but sort of deprioritizing content that we know is divisive, we know is kind of trying to mislead people, so that even though it's there, it's not necessarily going to be seen by a wider range of users. Only the people that actually are looking for that content will be able to find it. So kind of deprioritization could be another way that we kind of balance that freedom of speech with sort of countering mis and disinformation.
And presumably that will always come back to how social media platforms are instructed to implement any of those sort of safeguards through regulation.
Exactly, yeah. No, I mean, we have the Online Safety Act, which does enforce a lot of those obligations. And so I'm hoping that we may see more efforts to try and counter this moving forward.
One more question from the general public. Simone asks if you have any tips or advice to help normal people like them to detect whether or not something has been AI generated.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say more broadly than that, we shouldn't necessarily be focusing so much on whether something is AI generated or not, but actually whether it can be trusted. Because crucially, for example, something might be an AI generated piece of content, but it might be incredibly evidence-based and trusted in terms of the source of the information. So I don't think necessarily that that's the major issue. Having said that, though, I think some of the basic things that people can do are, firstly, just don't rely on social media entirely for your news. I know it goes without saying, but please just cross-reference your sources. If you see something that's considered to be kind of breaking news or really controversial or a major story, then it's almost certainly going to be cited by a kind of mainstream broadcasting media or a trusted source. So please check those to see if that is actually genuine content. Also, I think looking carefully at where your content is coming from. So if you see an image or video, you're not sure about whether it's, say, AI generated or if it's real, check who's posting it, see if they're a verified account, see if they've got other posts that maybe look a bit dodgy. Are they posting quite questionable content, or are they actually posting, kind of evidence-based sources linked to sort of original news broadcasters and whatnot? And the other thing is also, although it's going to be increasingly harder as the AI models get better, if you've got an image that might be AI generated, look at things like the faces, but also the hands. Typically, you can see, for example, that most people in an AI generated image will have like 6 fingers or if there's like an image in a crowd of people, the faces at the back are likely to look really garbled up and quite scary looking, actually. So they're kind of some of the minor kind of flaws you might see in the images or the videos as well.
A quick follow-up on that. You did mention, trusted sources like mainstream media, but to many, mainstream media is just not to be trusted. So what happens to them? How do we, what do we say to them or convince them otherwise?
Well, I think in some cases, many of them are often almost kind of too deep into the weeds of kind of what I like to call kind of hyper partisan media outlets, or media outlets that are very much kind of disseminating one sort of point of view and not taking a very balanced approach to sort of issues. And again, I think unfortunately it comes back to sadly the way that the social media algorithms work. If we can better sort of promote and amplify trusted sources of information, whether they're coming from mainstream media outlets or not, then I do think that would go a long way into helping kind of gradually sort of erode those kind of echo chambers, as it were. But yeah, I definitely don't think that, mainstream media is the only option. There are plenty of independent, small-based kind of news organizations, but also fact-checking organizations as well, like Full Fact and Logically Facts are both great ones in the UK. There's the likes of Snopes as well, or Snopes, I think it's called in the US. So there are other sources. You don't necessarily have to just rely on your kind of mainstream broadcasting media if you don't necessarily feel like they're trustworthy. There are third-party, fact-checking organizations and smaller media outlets that can provide those balanced stories as well.
Sam, thank you so much. Our list of questions is long, but our time is short. I do have one final question for you before you have to run off. So, if Sam Stockwell were the Minister for Poem, that's the prevention of AI-enabled misinformation, what would be your first poetic piece of legislation?
Oh, great question. I don't know if I'm going to put it as poetically as that, but I do think one of the big things that I would implement is just having what we're calling digital provenance features embedded in the entirety of the internet ecosystem. So that's essentially a record of who created a piece of content, what they used to create it, when it was created, and if it was edited. I think having that information embedded by default across the entirety of the internet, from the moment a piece of content is created to when it's, say, posted on social media, would go a long way in helping people to figure out what the hell they're viewing, where it's coming from, and should they trust it.
Nice. I like that a lot. That's a brilliant idea. Is it going to happen?
I'm hopeful. I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sam. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
And thank you for having me on, guys. Really appreciate it. And yeah,
Cool.
Maybe we should get that poem out there as one of the recommendations in our future reports in the government department or something.
You can keep the acronym. You can have it.
Thank you so
No
much.
worries. Take care.
Right, moving on. We're going to space.
Mm-hmm.
Our Hoover's broken.
Why is it broken?
Don't know. It's the third one in as many years. We just can't find a perfect vacuum.
Oh.
Space is a perfect vacuum.
I love that. I love space, and I love space jokes.
Okay, we've been looking forward to a lot of big space exploration stories this year. Although some of the juiciest have been pushed back, such as India's probe to Venus, the USA's return to the moon, and Japan's mission to Mars, there have still been some big moments. Have you had a fave that you've been following, Smera?
Personally, I think ISRO, that's the Indian Space Research Organization's strides in space exploration is nothing short of impressive. Many of the missions that have been built and launched have been done at a fraction of the cost of the amount that NASA invests. The previous Chandrayaan-1 rover, which discovered water locked in minerals on the moon, is one such example, which was done at a fraction of the cost and one of the biggest discoveries we've had in the recent time. Besides that, I think the probe into Europa could lead to some huge discoveries as well. What about you?
Yeah, I loved watching the build-up and launch of the Europa probe, although there's not much to see now until 2030. I also watched the first spacewalk ever done by a civilian, and it was the farthest anyone has been And it was the highest, or the farthest anyone has been since the Apollo moon missions 50 years ago. And that was SpaceX and billionaire Jared Isaacman's Polaris Dawn. Did you watch it? Did you hear, he went for a kind of Armstrong-esque quote? Did you hear it? It's not bad. I'm not dissing it, but, it's back at home. We have a lot of work to do. But from here, Earth sure looks like a perfect world.
Beautiful. Was not expecting that accent. I feel that was exactly what I needed. It's kind of weird how like this year 2024 became the year of AI, but there've been so many developments in space exploration. Even the Booker Prize went to Orbital, which is a book about a bunch of astronauts in space traveling across the world, and I think it's a really beautiful book. But also re-emphasizes how space was a huge part of this year.
Yeah, it's on my Burrow Box reservations.
Aside from the spacewalk being a really impressive technological feat, I do wonder what the future holds now. That for the first time, we are seeing private companies look beyond space tourism and actually stake their claim in research and exploration, where only government bodies have gone before.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to change things up there. Will corporations be able to abide by space law? You can't buy a planet. You can't own space. Not naming any names, but you know who you are.
And I wonder what it would mean for these commercial parties to go up into the ISS and see what role they play in keeping the very delicate political balance that takes place in such a multinational outer space satellite.
Yeah, will they be able to keep their political differences aside?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, with all this activity going on in space, not to mention the almost 10,000 active satellites we have in Earth's orbit for communications and weather monitoring, and the 3,000 odd dead satellites still flying around, along with something like 37,000 chunks of general stuff, bits of rockets, shrapnel from collisions and so on, space is getting quite crowded.
It is. And it's only going to get more crowded as companies like SpaceX and Amazon launch masses of satellites into orbit. So many of these masses of satellites or satellite arrays are actually called constellations. And the reason why it's important is that even tiny fragments up there, even those smaller than 10 centimeters, of which the UK Space Agency says there are millions, can actually cause massive problems if they collide with our comms and weather satellites. Also, it isn't easy to just laser blast the end of use or defunct satellites. The debris from such blasts could lead to what's called the Kessler syndrome, where there's a chain reaction of collisions, and these collisions could also re-enter our atmosphere and be very dangerous, even lethal to those on terra firma.
Okay, so AI to the rescue. The University of Strathclyde are leading on the creation of a new institute, AI for Space Sustainability. You know whose name is among the many international partners?
Mm-hmm, I do.
Well, I know you do, but work with me here.
Is it us? Is it the Alan Turing Institute?
Yeah, girl. We are going to help make space more spacious.
Yes. So the year-long project will use AI in a number of ways. So they're looking at using machine learning to help predict the motion of space objects, again, with the hope of reducing the risk of collisions and improving spaceflight safety. They want to develop autonomous operations of space objects to reduce the need for humans to go up there or send more things up there. They will also analyze the environmental impact of future space systems for longer term environmental sustainability. And they champion, very importantly, robust and explainable AI, hoping to reduce the barrier between human beings and AI.
Professor Massimiliano Vasile, director of the Aerospace Centre of Excellence at Strathclyde and lead on the project, said, "The sustainability of the use of space is essential to enable any future space activity. Some of the satellites we launch into space are there because we want to be more sustainable on Earth, to use fewer resources and have a lower impact on the climate. Unfortunately, that means we are extracting resources from Earth and launching them into space, and then leaving them there as space junk."
That is really interesting. And like I said, I really like how their focus is on explainable AI. And importantly, I really like their approach that looks at working across borders and involving everyone. The fact that space exploration began in the Cold War at a time where everyone was on opposing ends, but we've still managed to reach this point where countries actually come together and don't harm each other whilst trying to fix, satellites in space, which I think it's a beautiful thing that we are human and we will eventually come together, even if it's at over 100 kilometers above the actual planet. But can I add a few more interesting pieces of news that I found exciting this month?
You sure can.
So NASA have teamed up with Microsoft to create an AI chatbot designed to make it easier to access and understand scientific data about Earth. They're doing this using NASA's massive amounts of geospatial information to create responses that make sense to curious little Earthlings like you and I.
I know you really mean just me. You understand the actual science papers.
I think that I know. But I also think it could include aliens with the right prompt skills. They can ask chatbots about fun things like weather or, how to access geospatial data about Earth. And this is amazing because navigating those large amounts of data is pretty complex. But now you can not only access that data in a user-friendly way, but you can also possibly build apps and models that could change the world for the better.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Actually, yeah, I look forward to playing around with it when it's launched.
Oh, even though there's so much more space stuff to talk about, I think we're starting to wrap up.
Yes, we are. I haven't even touched on space poos and dinosaur planets from my research, but we ain't got the time, we ain't got the space.
But listeners can always go back to series 1, episode 6, if they want to hear a discussion about mining for minerals in outer space.
Yes, that was a good one. That was back when I was allowed stupidly long titles for each episode.
And what was that episode called?
That was called Will Plutocrats Be the First to Mine in Space? Not really artificial, not especially intelligent, and on that farm he had robots with a bot here and a bot there. I wonder why I'm not allowed those titles anymore. So we should address the elephant in the room, Smera, before we say goodbye. I can see you're welling up already. Next episode, the last of the series, will be your final episode.
Yes, it will be my final episode. I'm going to be moving back to India for a bit and exploring new opportunities there.
At least that sounds exciting. Winnie the Pooh once said something very wise on this subject. How lucky am I to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard?
That's actually true.
It's beautiful, isn't it? So it being your last episode next month, we have given you free rein to talk about microchips, your favourite subject. So I think we should probably offer up to listeners that they can ask some questions to you. So do you want to kind of give a overview of what you might be talking about, so that they can hone their questions to you?
Oh, I mean, now that I've been given free rein, I also feel like I need to be a bit mindful and not go into a speech for like 40 minutes about all my favorite fun facts about chips. But I think I would like to concentrate on what the geopolitical implications of chips and chip makers are going to be in the new year, with new governments coming to power in different parts of the world, what that ecosystem is going to look like. I'd also be keen to see what new chip startups might come to the fore, and maybe finally figure out if the heart of this entire ecosystem is actually just chips, or if I've just been lying to myself.
Okay, so listeners, if you can think of some questions about chips, that would help me out a lot. And you can reach us at the usual channels. And do feel free to send in your questions that might not be about chips too. We will get round to them, if not next episode, then at another date. But we always love to have challenging questions to fire at our experts.
Or cute fan mail. I would love some fan mail, please.
Or cute fan mail, yeah, that would be nice, yeah. So yes, send your cute fan mail, or indeed questions, to podcast@turing.ac.uk if you're an email preferer. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at TuringInst. We're on LinkedIn, we're on YouTube, we're all over the shop. And if you enjoyed this, then you might enjoy the Turing Lectures, the last one of which for this series is on the 9th of December at King's Place in the Knowledge Quarter, not in the unknowledgeable 3/4. Avoid that. Sorry. Thank you, bye.
Thank you and goodbye.